And let's share screen again. There we go. Share. And welcome to the discussion on Reconstruction. So go ahead and write that down. Discuss the questions Reconstruction sought to answer for the nation. Within your discussion, describe the three phases of Reconstruction, and finally describe the promise and hope of Reconstruction and its eventual demise. So what's required here is please everybody turn on your cameras when you attend these things. Want to make sure you guys, I don't want to, because I've done it in department meetings. I'm doing something else while the chair's talking. No, I actually don't do that, but I know people who do, and that's not good. So Pablo, if you want to get credit for this, Marianne and Francisco, turn on your cameras. And then don't hesitate at all to turn on your mics. Keep your mics off just so there's no background noise. But if you got a question you need me to clarify, let me know. So make sure you've written this down, discuss the questions, and I'll go ahead. This one right here. That's basically what we're going to take a look at today in this discussion. All right. Let me make this bigger. Why isn't it? Oh, okay, sorry. There we go. So what we're going over today is now in the chat, that prompt. Okay. So let's first off, right, Reconstruction is a time period that follows the Civil War, right? We got to reconstruct the nation. It was, let me make sure we really appreciate this. Reconstruction was brutal. I'm not Reconstruction, the Civil War was brutal. Civil wars are always brutal. War is brutal, obviously, by definition, but civil wars have a tendency to be even more brutal and cruel because it's more personal, right? So if you think about a soldier who went off to Vietnam, well, most of the soldiers had no problem with the Vietnamese. They were just going there because somebody told them to, the government told them to, right? Or they thought they were defending capitalism and democracy against communism, right? It was an ideological reason, but they had no problem with the people there inherently, right? It was a tragic war, and that's sometimes what happens. In a civil war, people tend to really blame the other side in a very personal way. And that's where the fighting and the violence gets really brutal. And the result is, it looks like this. Now, what you see here is these are the major battles of the Civil War, Vicksburg all the way to Gettysburg. Look at these numbers. These numbers, like Gettysburg was a few days, but Vicksburg, this was an hour. An hour. 19,233 people died. Within a few days, 51,000 people on either side died. Part of why these numbers are big is the technology is advancing, and they're still fighting in that old-fashioned way of having regiments basically line up and walk towards each other, right? And those strategies were based on muskets that weren't very accurate and powerful. Now they have rifles and revolvers and all of this kind of stuff, right? Cannons are much more accurate. And so people are dying by the droves. But also, yeah, these people are pissed off at each other. Disease is also a big factor of why people are dying, right? To give you some perspective of those numbers, because it's some, you look at something like that and go, okay, well, people die during war. Well, this is how to keep it in perspective. You add up all of these numbers from World War II down to the Gulf War, it does not add up to this number here, the amount of people who die. And this number here is very conservative. There's estimates 750 to 850,000 people. We're talking 3 to 4% of the population dead, mainly young men, right? Who, especially back then, were vital to the economy, right? This is a time when women were basically precluded from professional trades. And so what do you do when you lose 4% of young men that are expected to go into the professional trades to keep the economy roaring, right? Not a good situation. Also, what this indicates is this is millions of people whose lives are destroyed. This means that fathers aren't coming home, husbands aren't coming home, brothers, friends aren't coming home, especially if you are a mother, right? You got 4 or 5 children and your husband's not coming home. This is before any kind of safety net was provided to the American people. You're on your own. Lives are destroyed, right? The trauma from the Civil War is unbelievably well, we can't begin to appreciate the trauma that people experienced during this, right? Just to give you kind of an idea of how people fought, right? This is just guys with these weapons hurling steel at each other back and forth until they kill enough to where they gain this ground, right? These are some of the famous generals here. Here's an actual photo of, and the Civil War is one of the most, to date, there's hundreds of these photos, right? I don't have too many of them available in this PowerPoint, but if you just do a Google search, you will see photos, right? This has been enhanced, colorized, but this technology has been newly introduced, and there were journalists on the ground taking pictures of a tragic event like this, right? To get a sense of why the Civil War was fought, let's take a look at why the Confederates fought this war. And this is important to understand, real important to understand. Because today you sometimes hear the issue of slavery being discounted. Yeah, it was a factor, but not too important. That's nonsense. The people living at that time, the people who were part of the Confederacy. So to make sure everyone understands, right? You've got the Union up in the north, right? States like New York, Pennsylvania, right? Connecticut, New Hampshire, right? Maine, all part of the north. Down below, states like the one we live in, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, right? About 15 of them seceded from the United States and created their own country called the Confederate States of America, right? So this gentleman here, Alexander Stephens, this is the vice president of the Confederate States of America. And he's explaining quite clearly why the Southern states broke from the Union and created their own country. So let's see what he has to say about it. African slavery as it exists among us is the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. And by present revolution, what he's referring to there is the Civil War. From the South's perspective, this is the Second American Revolution, right? From the North's perspective, this is a Civil War. Jefferson, so he's referring to Thomas Jefferson here, anticipated this. He anticipated this Civil War as the rock upon which the old Union would split. So that's a quote from Jefferson in 1820, where he anticipated that. He didn't know when, but it was inevitable that a civil war was going to happen. What was conjecture, conjecture means guessing, what was conjecture with him is now realized fact. Here we are, we're about to fight, right? This is right before the Civil War begins, shortly after this speech that he's given, shortly after the South has seceded and created their own country. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. So what is this rock that Jefferson was referring to? What is the foundation? The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statements at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, the US Constitution that we have today, were that enslavement of African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Now, Stephens is highly exaggerating here, but he has somewhat of a point. There were people that did feel that way. People like Alexander Hamilton or John Adams did have principled concerns socially, morally, and politically about slavery. Most Southerners did not, and most Northerners were concerned and had some sense that this is going to be a problem, especially since you have a country that is founded on the idea of equality under the law, individual rights, right? All men are created equal. What they're talking about there is Yeah, some people are rich, some people are poor, some people are very capable, some people are not as capable, right? That's not what we're talking about when it comes to equality. What we're talking about is everybody, by virtue of being alive, by virtue of your life, should expect equality under the law. Whether you are the president of the United States or just an average guy, right? If you break the law, you should be held accountable. And if someone has done you wrong, justice should presume, right? Theoretically, that's what America is all about. Doesn't always happen, but it does happen on occasion, right? That's what they were talking about. And a lot of the statesmen that he's referring to had an assumption that slavery would die out for a variety of reasons. It didn't, and it strengthened. The Louisiana Territory Purchase is one of the reasons why slavery is going to flourish, and the cotton gin, right? It's going to. But his point here is that at least there was a discussion that this might not work out, right? Having slavery coupled with a nation not predicated on ethnicity, race, religion, like most nations have been throughout history, but on an idea that the individual is worth something. And the state, the government, should protect that individual's rights, no matter where they are in life. That's what's at the difference here. So he goes on. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the idea of government built upon it. When the storm came and the wind blew, it fell, right? So he's basically saying that the rock this country should have been built on is that people of African descent are biologically inferior, and therefore their enslavement is justified. So if you ever hear any inclination that slavery had nothing to do with it, it's just objectively wrong. Look up you can just Google South Carolina, Mississippi, the Confederate States of America. All of the states and then Confederate States of America as a government published their own Declaration of Independence, and most of them include sentiments like this, that Africans are somehow created by God for white people, at least wealthy white people, to exploit, to make sure that they stay wealthy and can grow their wealth. All right. Let me know if there's any questions or comments about this. If there are, just let me know. Let's see why the North engaged in the Civil War. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. This is, okay, sorry, let me give you some background. So the South secedes from the Union in 1861, right? Now Lincoln has a choice. The war wasn't inevitable. In fact, there were people on Lincoln's cabinet that urged him to let the South go, especially as the war began. And it became clear that this war was going to last a long time and the casualties would be great. Let the South go. They're a 1-2 cash crop economy. They're backward, right? This would be the sentiment of people back then who, Northerners, right? They're dependent on the North, and that's true. They will come crawling back. Bloodshed isn't necessary. But Lincoln said, no, we have to engage in this. We cannot let Southern states, any state, go unchecked that decides to leave the Union because they are unhappy with the election results. And that's ultimately why the South left. They didn't agree. Now, it wasn't like the 2020 election where you have the president say that there was cheating involved. It's just that the South said, okay, the majority of people in the Electoral College elected Lincoln, that he represents the North. This guy has nothing to do with the plantation system and the Southern way of life. So we're out. We're not satisfied with the election results and we're out. And so what Lincoln is going to say is we cannot leave that unchecked. If we leave that unchecked, then we're going to have a whole bunch of states, independent nations in this continent, the continent of America, right? That is now just one nation. We could have a whole bunch of them. And whenever that happens, you have the tendency for nation states to go to war with each other when they are vying for resources. And when that happens, democracy, representative government, individual rights begin to disintegrate. It's always happens with war, right? And keep in mind, the United States is only 86 years old. It really is, even though it's democracy, its representative government is highly flawed. Most rights don't apply. Rights don't apply to most people in this country. If you take in consideration the enslaved people, women, indigenous people, any immigrant coming from anywhere other than Europe, right? It's a flawed democratic society. However, it was the only one really in the world. And this is typical. Societies that try democracies, they typically don't last. It just makes sense, and it's just a lot more efficient if you have one person or a group of people in charge and everybody falls in line. It's not a good way of creating a flourishing society or a healthy society, but that's typically how societies gravitate. They gravitate towards authoritarians. And this is what Lincoln wants to avoid. So what does he say? So this is a response to a famous publisher, Horace Greeley, who's asking Lincoln, why are we fighting this war? Does it have anything to do with slavery? Here's his response. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. So in other words, and this is kind of, I mean, when you think about Lincoln, he's the guy who freed the slaves, right? At the beginning of the war, he's basically saying, yeah, slavery is peripheral to my concerns, right? If I need to free some of them, I'll do that. If I need to free all of them, I'll do that. If I need to free none of them, I'll do that if it preserves the Union. And so again, why is he thinking? He's thinking long term. And it's not just for America. He's deeply committed to this idea of a nation state that is of the people and for the people, where the people are sovereign, right? So the American Revolution, it's not 100% a revolutionary event, but what is revolutionary about the American Revolution is it flipped on its head how societies have been ordered through millennia, going back as far as 10,000 years. There has always been a sovereign, a king, an emperor, a pharaoh, right? Or a group of oligarchs, and everybody else was at the grace of the sovereign. Meaning, like, if you own property, you were basically borrowing that from the king, right? What the American Revolution basically did for the world, or at least attempted, is that no, sovereignty is within the people. And the government is there to serve the people, not to reign over the people. Obviously, there's rules, there's laws that keep people in order so other people aren't trampling on other people's rights, right? This is, if you blast, you might own your own home and have a great stereo, but if you're blasting at 3 in the morning and keeping your neighbors up, right? Well, you don't really have the freedom to do that because your other neighbors have the right to get a decent night's sleep before they have to get to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? So obviously there's laws that the state imposes, but it's from a representative government. Again, this is all theoretical. It doesn't always work out, right? And for many people throughout American history, it didn't work out at all, right? This was a white man's country for most of its history, and there are definitely still people alive who feel that we should return to that. I disagree with those people, but this is what, and the founding generation of this country referred to America as an experiment, right? And it still continues to be an experiment, and it's not guaranteed. Again, the default government of any society is authoritarianism, a dictator, a king, somebody who has absolute authority over his subjects. America did away with that, and it's spread. It's spread. Not all countries, like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, do not have that mindset, but a lot of European countries do. A lot of other countries around the world, South America, Central America, although it might be flawed, there is at least a movement towards that, right? This is what he wants to preserve. And it's fragile, only 86 years old. And if we allow states to secede from the Union willy-nilly because they're upset about an election, or they're upset about some law Congress passed, or they doubt the legality of the election, maybe somebody cheated, we're out, right? Then we're going to be, if you look at Europe, the history of Europe, a bunch of nation states tightly packed together, vying over resources. For most of European history, up until World War II, they were at war with each other. And as a result, democracy couldn't flourish, right? So keep that in mind. I was going to go into Reconstruction. I might do that later, but I don't want to take up too much time, and my son is probably going to be here any second and needs to go. But I think there's a lot here. So instead of that original prompt, talk about the impact of the Civil War on lives, right? And why the South fought the war and why Lincoln fought the war. One last thing, this is going to change. It is going to be about slavery. And it's going to be about slavery for a couple of reasons. One main reason. England and France were they were assisting the Confederacy, but they were just about to, in a more robust way, offering direct military support, sending their armies, sending their navies to defeat the North. England and France were also very active for several generations, going back throughout the 1800s, the early 1800s and on, dismantling the international slave trade, especially England. So England cannot support a nation state that is trying to preserve slavery. But as long as Lincoln is discounting the effect of slavery, it gives enough room for a country like England to come in to support the South, right? And why would they do that? Well, England is still a little bit sore about losing their colonies, right? And this might be a good way of regaining some of their former colonies, even though it's been 86 years, right? This is a good way of disrupting this, and maybe they can pick off some geography and exploit some resources out of the ashes of the Civil War. That's not going to happen, but that was probably their intention. What happens is that there is a battle, the Battle of Antietam. It's the first major victory of the North, and this gives Lincoln some momentum. For about 2 years, it did look like the North was going to lose the Civil War. And once Antietam happens in late 1862, I think September of 1862, the momentum changes. And this gives him enough political room to say this is not just a war to preserve the Union, but also a war to end slavery. The reason why he had to be careful about, because he was against slavery. He wasn't an abolitionist, but he did find slavery to be morally impugnant. And the people who insisted on enslavement were backward people and had spiritual problems, to say the least. But there's a couple of reasons why he couldn't just come out and say it was a war against slavery. One, most people in the North they're not enlightened white people. They're just as racist as the people in the South, right? To be white meant to be a white supremacist back then. That was part of the identity of being white. It was a pathology. It was a sickness. It remains a sickness, but it was everybody. It was just the way things were. And they are not going to want to fight a war to free these people. In fact, one of the reasons why a lot of rank and file Americans in the North were motivated to fight this war, there's several reasons for it, but one of the reasons is they're pissed off at the South for producing so many people of African descent. The slave trade in America was internal, meaning, and this is what's so insidious about American slavery, is these people were bred like livestock. Every major plantation had a breeding pen where women were raped, and they were producing strong enslaved people to make more money so they can buy and sell these slaves, right? Well, states like South Carolina had a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning 50% more enslaved people of African descent than white people living in South Carolina. And if you actually in your head, this is wrong thinking, but if in your head feel that an entire group of people are inferior and are dangerous as a result of their inferiority, especially if they become free, basically a lot of rank and file white Northerners were looking at the South going, look at what you produced, right? And so in no way are they going to want to fight a war to end slavery, right? But with the prospect of England about to be on the side of the Confederacy, and with the momentum of Antietam and then other battles that the North is going to win, this becomes a war to end slavery. The war itself ends slavery. So you've got Northern soldiers coming in to invading the South, right? If you're an enslaved person and you're seeing the North coming in, this invading army, you're going to run to them. And now the Northern Army has to figure out what to do with these people. And so at first, no way are we going to make them soldiers. They were used as contraband for basically digging graves and helping out at makeshift hospitals, brutal places. Later, they are going to be soldiers, right? But yeah, at first it was a dilemma. Like we're not fighting this war to end slavery, so we don't want to take these people from the plantations. But if we give them back, then we're only aiding and abetting our enemy, right? But again, this is going to change after Antietam in September of 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation will be issued, and that initiates the process to legally end slavery. But during the war, it's practically ending on itself. Enslaved people, through the chaos of the war, are running away in mass. Anyway, I'll conclude it there. Anybody have any questions? I see Marianne is about to fall asleep, so sorry I bored you. No, I'm just kidding. No, relax. Yeah. So write a summary basically explaining why the South wanted to fight the war. You might want to include the guy's actual name and explain what he's getting at here, and then talk about what this guy is getting at here of why the North fought the war, why he chose to fight the war, the casualties that were involved, and why the war shifted from not only preserving the Union and why that was important, right? Make sure you understand why that was important. It's not just we want to keep the United States as big as it is. It's the very real prospect that if we have a bunch of nation states here that have seceded from the original United States, then we have a real problem on our hand. The ingredients for perpetual warfare are here, and during war, that's when rights get taken away. It happened during the Civil War itself. Abraham Lincoln just put people in cages that were critical of him. He suspended what's referred to as habeas corpus, put them in prison. He can't afford to have people talk bad about this war because he needs to end this war as quickly as possible. He knows he's destroying lives. The guy was suicidal during his tenure as president. He took this on, unbearable amounts of pain, sobbing at night, right? Have you ever lost a loved one, someone real close to you? That's what he experienced every single day. He took that on as a loss, as profoundly painful of that. And if you've ever been in that situation where you lose a father, a wife, a child, a friend, it's the worst pain you can ever go through. That's what he was dealing with. He can't afford to have people prolong this war and politicize this. He imprisoned those people and let them out after the war. World War I, people who spoke out against the war were imprisoned as well, up to 20 years. World War II, Japanese Americans had their property taken away from them, and then they were put in prison camps, right? Vietnam War, you had the FBI spying on people, assassinating people that were part of the civil rights movement or part of the anti-war movement. The War on Terror, the Patriot Act, is a complete violation of our privacy. These things can be activated by the National Security Agency at any moment, according to the Patriot Act. Why was that made possible? Well, we got scared after September 11th, right? What all that has in common is a deterioration of our rights. And if it continues, yeah, we might lose our democratic society, our way of government, right? If warfare continues. That's what Lincoln was worried about. That's why he said this war was incredibly important. Here we have this opportunity as human beings on this planet. This is what Lincoln was thinking, to preserve this concept, as flawed as it was back then, of representative government where people have individual rights. And if we allow this to happen, even as flawed as it was back then, there's no way to reduplicate this idea of representative government and individual rights. All right, I've promised to end this a couple of times, so I'll leave it there. I can stay on as long as anyone wants me to if you have any questions about what was just discussed or anything regarding the course. So what I will do in the right now is, and do let me know if you have any questions, but I'm going to post a, I'll have a folder posted. And let me make sure I'll have a folder posted, and in that folder will be the video, so you could rewatch it, and an assignment where you can type in basically a summary of what was just discussed here. And depending on how you do, right, it doesn't count against you. So, you know, if you don't do it, no big deal. If you do it and you could have done better, no big deal. You'll still earn credit, but you can earn up to 10% extra credit towards Unit 1, right? So keep that in mind. But that assignment will be posted in the folder shortly. So stop recording. There we go.